Thank you for that very generous introduction. As the joke goes, my father would have enjoyed it and my mother would have believed it. I'm super excited that we're all back together again here at GEM to work on some of new possibilities, new ideas of where to move the development discussion forward. We're meeting at an odd time in which a lot of the people writing books are writing books about dark subjects. And many of them are in the room. So, but maybe one of the reasons for the darkness is that a specter is haunting the world. We have leaders that seem to mobilize a lot of their own citizens, but for the non-citizens and for many of the minorities, they feel sort of like ominous. There's several of them. This is Orban in Hungary, Le Pen, Farage, and this is my own nightmare. And for some, there's others are worried here. So all of this has created a whole discussion about where is the world going in terms of its institutions and so on. So we will have here tomorrow afternoon Steve Levitsky, who's just written a book on how democracies die. It's a book that is directed to the US but inspired in Venezuela. We will discuss with Jascha Munk, who has this recently issued book on the people versus democracy, so this popular uprising against sort of like democracy, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's sort of like an aspect of reality. We will talk tomorrow afternoon with Tim Snyder, who he is the ultimate author of Darkness. He has a book called Bloodlands, has another book on the Holocaust called Black Earth, and this book is on the present, where super scary stuff about how the end of truth and many things have caused enormous events in Russia and Europe and in the US that we're not fully aware of. So there's this sort of like darkness in the air. And even to a brighter messenger like Steve Pinker, who's going to be talking to us tomorrow at lunch, he has to come up with a defense of reason, science, humanism, and progress. As these are controversial ideas these days, and it needs sort of like a heavyweight like Steve Pinker to come out in defense of things that we thought were sort of like kind of obvious. So this is a little bit the intellectual atmosphere in which we are meeting. Part of what we're trying to achieve is sort of like a deeper understanding of where is this malaise coming from. And part of the malaise is coming from our inability to understand what is happening. So, for example, here, when something happens that you don't like, you say, well, it's irrational. So, Brexit is a perfect example of irrational behavior. Or Brexit was fueled by irrational xenophobia, not real economic grievances, and so on. So now the world is becoming crazy, and so on. The only problem is that at least I'm a sort of like card-carrying economist, and for a card-carrying economist, you cannot talk about irrationality lightly, because we have a very precise definition of rationality, and I'm going to argue that in our precise definition of rationality, there's nothing irrational about people's choices, because Homo economicus, which is sort of like our model of human behavior, is based on the idea that we all have preferences, and we have nothing to say about our preferences. We assume that they are given, exogenous, something or other. There's some literature on endogenizing those preferences that I'll refer to you later on. But sort of like the idea is, de gustibus non est disputandum. Of taste, there's nothing to discuss. People are free to have their own preferences, right? But we do face constraints. And what we do is we have brains, and we use our brains to figure out, given our constraints, what do we like the most among the things that are available to us. And that's what we mean by rationality, that people will behave in such a way that they choose what they prefer given what's feasible. That's it. So we have nothing to say about preferences, so they are exogenous. We understand a lot about budget constraints, so we know if the constraint shifts out, people can buy more of everything. If the constraint tilts, then they'll buy less of something and more of other things. And 125% of economic policy is based on that intuition, right? It's about shifting constraints, taxing, subsidizing, transferring, whatever. All of economic policy is really about shifting the constraints because we have nothing to say about preferences. But for the same reason, it doesn't make any sense to say that voting for Brexit is irrational, because you can say, well, if you vote for Brexit, GDP will fall, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, you can say, yeah, I know that GDP will fall, but I would rather be in a poorer place that is purer than in a richer place that is more diverse, where people speak with an accent. And as an economist, you cannot say that those preferences are irrational, because there's nothing irrational about preferences. They are exogenous, right? So now that means that all the interesting stuff is in the preferences. And what are these preferences? Where are these preferences coming from? What's behind these preferences? So economics, Homo economicus has been sort of like playing a defensive game, because this description of Homo economicus I just gave you has been challenged by a revolution that came from psychology. Daniel Kahneman is a card-carrying psychologist, and he got the Nobel Prize in economics. And Richard Thaler is a card-carrying economist who got a Nobel Prize in economics, but on work that is related to changing the view of Homo economicus. In particular, that revolution, it was based on one part of psychology, which is cognitive psychology. And that part of cognitive psychology said, okay, economists believe in these axioms of human behavior. Let's take these axioms to the lab. And let's see if humans behave according to the axioms of behavior that Homo economists believe. And they found that in the lab, people don't behave that way. Okay? And that led to the idea that people were bad at making decisions. So, for example, one of the things that we teach now in the school is decision theory, and how we can correct the decisions that people make, because they make systematic mistakes in decision making. So they have loss aversion. So if you just change the question by emphasizing the negative, they change their preference. If they have had a recent experience of something, they overestimate the probability of that something happening again. They are very much influenced by the framing of questions or by anchoring of numbers. So they have 1,000 experiments that show that people are lousy decision makers. And the policy implication of all of that is we should nudge people into making better decisions. And so that's more or less it. It was a big revolution. Everybody's doing behavioral economics and so on, but that's the content of it. They did find a lot of super interesting things once they started to test things in the lab. The first thing that they found is this ultimatum game. In an ultimatum game, say you take one player, give him $100, say $100 bills, and you tell him to share that $100 with a second player. And if the second player accepts the split, they each keep their money. And if the second player says no to the split, they both get zero. So Homo economicus comes in and says, very simple, you should give $1. Because the other guy is going to say $1 is better than 0. So he accepts $1, you keep 99. End of story, Homo economicus has a perfect prediction. You put it in a lab, people reject offers below $40. So people are willing to sort of punish themselves because they feel that they have been somehow mistreated or treated unfairly and so on, and they'd rather be poor, but I don't know, honorable, than accept a low offer. So that already says that these preferences are weird and we should study them a little bit more, right? So the second very nice example is this Haifa daycare center, where some economists went to the daycare center to solve a problem. And the problem was that parents would arrive late, and because parents arrive late, it causes all sorts of cost to the daycare center. So if you want to change behavior, you should tax them. So let's impose a tax. Let's put a fine if you arrive late to pick up your children. They put the fine, and what happened? Parents arrived even later. And the interpretation of that experiment, if you want, is that before the fine, arriving late was impolite, was not the right way to treat people who are taking care of your children. It's imposing yourself unfairly on others. But if you have to pay a fine, then it's just a commercial transaction. I can decide to arrive early and not pay anything. If I arrive later, I pay for the cost. So at that price, I buy more. End of story. So again, that's very interesting. That's people behaving differently because now we are trying to understand, maybe they have different ways of understanding behavior, and it's not just movements in the constraint. There's something else happening in behavior. So it means that you have to sort of say something about preferences or about people's behavior if you're going to try to explain a lot of phenomena. So we have this year Jonathan Haidt with us, who has looked enormously at all of these dimensions of people's moral sentiments. We had last year Joshua Green in the group. And so Jonathan Haidt believes that people have sentiments of different quality or kind. And he's taking them again and showing this all the in lab situations. So people have, they care for people, they fear harm. We notice it when we care about a baby, that we feel a responsibility to care, we fear harm. We respond to fairness and cheating. That's another dimension that we sort of have. We feel loyalty, sense of loyalty, and the sense of betrayal. We see sense of authority versus subversion. People, disrespect authority and so on. Liberty versus oppression, sanctity versus degradation. So we have all these dimensions that, for us, in Homo economicus, are all exogenous and they're irrelevant, etc., because we don't change them. So we only change constraints. But clarifying a little bit of these dimensions and how framing different questions, making or calling some of these moral sentiments are going to have an impact on human behavior. Now, how did these sentiments evolve? Why do we have them? So we have with us Joe Henrich, who's going to speak later tonight together with Jonathan Haidt in the next section. And he would say, look, we evolved as a species because we are a cultural species. That is, in order to operate, we use a lot of knowledge, a lot of know-how, a lot of stuff that we don't have in us, we have in the network of people we interact with. So we are a cultural species, and culture is this sort of like this set of know-how, beliefs, practices that have evolved over all of our ancestors and that we use to survive and prosper. And what makes us human is our capacity to develop, to accumulate, to absorb, and to use this culture. And his point is that culture exists, if you want, not in a person, but in sort of like in the social brain, in the network of people we are connected to. It's transmitted culturally for the next generation of people coming on. And to the point that we are genetically cultural, that our genes have evolved to make us a cultural species, right? So we have a digestive system that is much shorter than the digestive system of primates because we presume to be eating cooked food. So our genes evolved to accommodate cooking. Our larynx evolved to accommodate speaking, right? Our muscle systems evolved to accommodate the fact that we were using guns and arms and spears and so on, and not just punches. So we evolved as a species together with the culture that we were evolving. And we evolved many mental processes to make us a cultural being. For example, he has fantastic results on showing that we are particularly good as a species at imitation. And imitation is important because if we all were to only live on the inventions that we do ourselves, we would die. But if we live with many, many other people, we would be much better off by just imitating and learning from other people. But in order to imitate, we need to decide who to imitate. And we should imitate, in principle, the people who are going to be most successful. And the people who are more successful are the people who have prestige. So we have a social sense of prestige that he believes is one of our sort of like evolved senses. And prestige is sort of like an interesting equilibrium that gives us, the people try to imitate those with prestige, but the guys with prestige derive some benefit from being prestigious, right? They are better treated and so on. So it's a principle, he would say, that is very different from dominance, which is a feeling that is among the other primates. They have dominance. They're alpha males and stuff. This one is a different sort of like orthogonal source of social hierarchy. But in order to be prestigious, you should be sort of like generous with your knowledge. And that's part of the transaction is that you are prestigious and you're treated as a prestigious person because you're generous with your knowledge, right? And so it's a particularly, maybe Steve Pinker would have called it the better angels of our what? The better angels of ourselves or something. So now, so we need to. So we live in this cultural milieu. We need to cooperate with each other to survive, and we need to cooperate with a problem that if we are supposed to cooperate, what will make us cheat the cooperation? So what will make us contain the free rider problem? Now, economists have a very simple answer for that. And that says it's sort of like the principal agent problem. What you need to do is you have to align incentives. You have to align incentives. You have to pay people, say, with stock options so that the manager chooses what's good for the firm, right? But evolution didn't do it that way. In the same way as, God's first command to man was to be fruitful and multiply. But it did not rely on our religious sense to be fruitful and multiply, right? It gave us a different instinct that makes us be fruitful and multiply. So it's not that it's religious indoctrination that got us here. So, and for the same reason, sort of like we cooperate because we developed a moral sentiment, a moral dimension that makes us behave in the way we behave. So if I free ride, I feel guilty, right? And then it makes me feel bad because I was supposed to be, to cooperate, but I didn't, so I feel guilty. When other people find out that I was supposed to cooperate, and I didn't, I feel ashamed, right? When I find out that other people were supposed to cooperate and cheated, I feel outraged, right? And in order to punish them, Martin Novak thinks, he was a professor here at Harvard, he thinks that we developed a punishment that was kind of safe and even pleasurable, right? And that punishment is gossiping, right? So we gossip about people who did not cooperate. And if we are the butt of gossip, we feel social pain, right? So we live on this cocktail of hormones and neurotransmitters that are all proteins, that are all coded for in our genes, that have evolved this moral sense on which cooperation is based. So who do we cooperate with? Well, we cooperate with us. So us. So we have a sense of responsibility to an us, right? So a sense of us. It's a very different form of cooperation than the one that Homo economicus is trying to solve. It's not that the incentives were aligned. It's that in some sense, we develop an identity with the group that makes us feel responsible towards the group, that makes us feel bad if we miss our responsibilities, and so on. So cooperation, evolution did not wait for Nobel Prizes in economics to come up with solutions to the cooperation problem. Evolution finds its own ways. And these ideas are now percolating into economics. Identity Economics is a book recently published by George Akerlof, who's also Nobel Prize in economics. And Sam Bowles has this other book on the moral economy, where it's all of these dimensions in which moral sentiments impact behavior. In identity economics, the idea is that people have identities, and identities to groups. I'm a Red Sox fan. I'm a neighbor. I'm a parent. I'm a boss. So each one of these categories has sort of like an ideal behavior. So there's like an ideal Red Sox fan or an ideal neighbor. And then if you behave in a way that is different from the ideal, that you derive from disutility, right? So actually, in some sense, the way we organize groups is by identifying people with a group, by developing norms and ideals of what group behavior should be like, and then people behave in the right way because they identify with a group. I hope that people at CID behave in the way they behave because they believe in us, they believe in the mission, they believe in the group. And it's not that, well, if you write more papers, I'll give you a 10% wage increase. It doesn't work that way, right? So now there are many different senses of us that underpin human behavior. I can say us, CID, us, the Kennedy School, us, Harvard University, us, Massachusetts or the US. So there are different scales of the us that we feel we belong to. Now, why have this discussion in the context of talking about development? Well, development really is about the accumulation of technology. In some sense, richer countries just know how to do more things or do things better. So it's all about knowing how to do better and more things. And to do things, you need tools, and technology is tools. To do things, you need codes, recipes, protocols, how to do manuals. But if all of technology was just tools and codes, the problem of development would be easy to solve because we would create an NGO. And that NGO would put the tools on a container and ship it to whatever we want, and would put the codes on the web, and then everybody would have access to the tools and the codes, and everybody would have all the technology. It would be a flat Earth, okay? But the problem is that when your tooth hurts, you don't just download an article from the web. You have to go to a dentist. And the dentist is somebody who uses tools, is somebody who follows protocols, but he mixes the tools and the protocols with something that is in his brain and nowhere else, which is know-how. So know-how is a critical component of technology. And what makes development difficult is the fact that moving know-how is difficult, and moving it from brain to brain is difficult. But what makes it even more difficult is the fact that modern technology requires not just the know-how in one brain, but the know-how in increasingly larger and larger teams of people. So to illustrate that, we can compare, say, a subsistence farming family in Ecuador. And this subsistence farming family, they have the necessary know-how and technology to make all of these things, and they are pretty much self-sufficient. So the family possesses the know-how necessary to be more or less independent. Here you have families that possess the necessary know-how to make these kinds of goods, but they are not independent, because the butcher cannot make a hamburger because he doesn't know how to make the bread, right? So the butcher knows about butchery, the baker knows about bakery, there's exchange, but at every production unit, there's an amount of know-how that sort of like fits in a family. There are no families that know how to make these products. The know-how necessary to make these products does not reside in a family, and if you go to more complex products, like this one, the know-how necessary to make this product doesn't even reside in a country. This is spread out in a bunch of companies across the whole. This is the Boeing 787. It's supposed to be a Boeing. Boeing makes less than 15% of the parts that go into this thing. To make the plane, you just need a humongous network of people cooperating in making this product. So the process of development, in some sense, is this process of accumulation of know-how, not because we go from a society of idiots to a society of geniuses, but become from a society where everybody knows the subsistence technology to a society where everybody knows different. And the society knows more because everybody knows different, because we have spread out the know-how across different heads, so that we have teams that can do collectively what individuals cannot do. And that means that a lot of implementing technology is not something that is done by individuals. You can be, a very smart and very able pilot, but a pilot doesn't fly a plane on his own. He needs all of these other people to fly the plane. So implementing technology involves creating complementary groups of people with different know-how that have to collaborate in the implementation of that technology. So that means that when you compare different technologies across the world, you have some technologies that are more self-sufficient. For example, this man probably is planting his own seeds. He's using his own fertilizers he makes with dung. He uses probably his own tools, and he knows how to repair them and so on. This guy uses a tractor, doesn't have a clue how to make a tractor, doesn't have a clue how to make the gasoline, doesn't have a clue how to make the genetically modified seeds or the agrochemicals, the insecticides, whatever. He doesn't know how to make any of that. He probably, if the machine breaks down, he knows the phone number to call, right? So it's not that this guy has more know-how than this guy. It's that this guy is collaborating with a much, much broader network of people with different complementary know-how. That is what allows this technology to be feasible. But if you take this guy here, either he learns from this other guy or he'll starve to death, right? So by knowing how to drive a tractor here when there's no tractor, or there's no repairman for the tractor, or there's no gasoline, there's no point, right? That technology is unfeasible in that network. So modern technology requires cooperation. More technology means cooperation, and more advanced technology means cooperations at broader and broader networks. So in our evolutionary past, we have evolved from people who were more or less subsistence, or close to subsistence, or very simple trade, or trade of a very small fraction of your output. And consequently, we lived in fairly small groups. And evidence, the archaeological evidence, if you want, of the small groups that we live through our history is expressed in language diversity. Because languages have a natural tendency to evolve, and they're only held together by the need to be understood by the other person. So if one group of people goes into two valleys and they never talk again, language will have evolved in each valley in a different direction, and over the course of a few generations, they can no longer talk to each other. So we know that, and we can see it in the world today because we live in sort of like, our history is a history of the Tower of Babel, right? In a place like Alaska, which has 700,000 people living in there, more or less, there are 19 languages. In a place like Mexico, there are over 130 languages. So it's not that there were, so like the Indians in Mexico and so on, they didn't have a concept of Indians, obviously, because they did not know there was India, but they didn't have a sense of us that encompassed all the people living in that place, right? In Cameroon, which has, say, half of the population of Spain, there are 230 languages. In Indonesia, there are over 700 languages. In India, there are over 1,600 languages. So that reflects the fact that people come from a history of interacting very little with people living near them. Their radius of interaction was very small. Now, obviously, with development and so on, the radius of interaction is supposed to be much bigger. And they're supposed to develop some kind of a sense of us out of a history of very little interaction to the point that they couldn't talk to each other. And they didn't share traditions, beliefs, and so on and so forth that go typically with language. So in Europe, which is sort of like the benchmark for development, you know, back when in the 13th century, this was the political map of the 13th century. No? You see an enormous fragmentation of things. It's hard to identify, any of the modern countries here, right? By the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, it had consolidated a little bit more, but you still had, nothing resembling Germany here or nothing resembling an Italy here. And then came the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, two things happened. The Industrial Revolution wanted access to bigger markets. That suddenly you had these factories, they could operate at a bigger scale, and suddenly they wanted access to bigger markets. So the Germanic-speaking peoples invented something that they called the Zollverein, the customs union. And the customs union was this idea, okay, so we have all of these jurisdictions and political entities and so on, but let's at least have free trade among ourselves, okay? So larger markets. But the second thing that it needed more public goods. That if you were going to have workers in a labor market earning a wage and so on, well, workers need training and so on, so who's going to educate them? They might get sick, who's going to take care of them? They might get old, do we need a pension system? They need to go to work, come back, so where's the infrastructure? How are you going to get materials in and out to these major manufacturing places and so on? So suddenly you need to create a bunch of public goods that were not really important before. Before that, you just needed, a government that to keep the peace, maybe have some as Adam Smith said, peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, and that's it, right? But the Industrial Revolution developed a technology that required many, many, many more public goods, and I'll say a little bit about it. So the economies of scale means that you want to have a broader sense of us. You want to be able to exchange, interact, cooperate with more people. So you want to be bigger, right? Like the Zollverein. But it also required a state that would provide more goods. And the more goods you need to provide, the deeper the sense of us you need to have. If we need to decide what is going to be taught in schools, well, we need to agree first, what is the language of instruction? Is there going to be prayer in schools? What is the history of the country that we're going to teach our children and so on and so forth? So When they created this Zollverein, etc., they thought this is great, but we need these common public goods. So what about creating a unified state? So German nationalism was not about, it's not like Catalonian nationalism, not that I'm against Catalonian nationalism, except that I don't want Barcelona to leave La Liga. But that's where they decided to create, by the way, for a Latin American, this is weird. 50 years after Latin American independence, they decided to create a German state, right? So in some sense, it's a younger state than our states. But the first thing that they realized is that they need to standardize a language, that nobody is speaking some standardized language. So they needed to create the Hochdeutsch, Standard Deutsch, or High Deutsch as a common language. And the same thing happened with Italian nationalism, which is something that happened at exactly the same time, say around 1870. And they also needed to decide, what is Italian? So they decided that Tuscan is Italian, and everybody had to learn to speak this new standardized language, and that's what would get taught in school and so on. But now these people, given up on the idea of a common language, maybe English, but they want to become something bigger, right? The EU. And in order to become part of the EU, you need to sign the acquis communautaire. And the acquis communautaire has, these are the names of the chapters of the acquis communautaire. This is how intrusive are the public goods that you have to agree on in order to sustain the technologies of today. So it gives you a sense of how intrusive are the set of public goods that have to be agreed upon. And in order to do that, there has been up to now sort of like a technocratic temptation of leaving all of these decisions to Europe, but there is no passionate, emotional sense of us Europeans. And the proof that there's no passionate, emotional sense of us Europeans is that they agreed on a common currency, but they could not agree on a common set of heroes. You don't see sort of like here the picture of Beethoven or Notre Dame de Paris and so on. It's just all very nondescript, something vaguely European, but not something you can say, I'm proud of this cultural heritage. So there's this lack of heart in the European project, which I think has come down to haunt them. So tomorrow morning, we're going to talk with Bart Bonikowski, who's doing research on how people think that makes them us. What is the sense of us that underpins their political behavior? So that's a picture of Bart. He says, grossly speaking, there are sort of like ethnic, cultural definitions of us, or there are more civic definitions of us. So the US is the typical country that traditionally has a more civic definition of us, that if you believe in the American dream and you respect the law and you eat hamburgers at least once a year, that you're kind of like us, right? Versus a more sort of like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or at least white, or at least Christian, or something that is more ethnocultural as a definition of the us. So he asks questions like, what does it take to be perceived as a true member of our community? And you can ask yourself the question, not about what you think makes somebody a good Kazakh or a good Sri Lankan or a good Albanian, etc. Not what you think, but what you think other people think is requisite to be perceived as a citizen, a member of your community. And he finds that answers to these questions determine essentially a huge part of your political opinions about everything else. Should we redistribute? Should we not redistribute? Et cetera, et cetera. How tolerant we should be vis-a-vis others and so on. It's all, in some sense, a function of what we think is, we build a sense of us upon. So in the developing world, these issues of state formation are very, very different. Very, very different. And we have not, I'm trained as a development economist. Up to now, when I would go to a country, I would not ask myself the question, what is the sense of us that underpins that political entity, and what are the conflicts around the sense of us that underpins that political entity? And what makes that construction of the sense of us? How does it limit the things that are thinkable, doable, and the things that are not? So, for example, we're now working on Sri Lanka, on Saudi Arabia, on Jordan, on Albania, on Mexico, etc. These are very, very different places. How do people, what makes us us in each one of these places? So if you look back in the 1800s, this was the political map of the world. And you see that these were all colonial areas. By 1945, there were only 50 sovereign countries in the world. And now there are almost 200. So there were a lot of state creation, very, very recent state creations. So you have states that need to, in some sense, be themselves, right? Develop a new sense of us. What does it mean to be Nigerian? It's not clear. I mean, to be Yoruba, to be Igbo, to be Hausa, etc. Those have, they have a language, they typically have a common religion, they have traditions, and so on and so forth. But Nigerian, thank God for the World Cup, right? Latin American countries are also weird because they became independent from Spain after 300 years of colonialism, but before the Industrial Revolution. And the way colonialization happened in the Americas, it was a collapse in population and a recreation of a population where everybody speaks the same language. So you have 18 countries speaking the same language and having the same dominant religion. You might have wondered, gee, it must be easy to unify them and have an EU. Well, how come there's no EU in Latin America, given how easy it should be in principle, given that you have the EU where everybody talks to each other with headphones, right? So, but obviously, the Industrial Revolution created incentives for economies of scale that didn't happen in Latin America. So what was the point of unifying with Colombia if we would not have had anything to trade with them or interact with them and so on? So actually, the country called the Great Colombia is today Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. So if anything, there's been movements in the opposite direction. The central capital of Guatemala is now Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and so on. So there's been movements in the opposite direction. The Arab world is also a unique place in the sense that they're all in the Ottoman Empire. Now there are 19 states that speak one language and have one dominant religion. You might have expected that these differences would have been more easily managed. And today the news is all about these conflicts in this region. You have Africa has 53 states and over 250 languages. So people say, oh, they didn't know where to put the borders. But unless you were going to put 2,500 borders, right, you would have had, in any case, very heterogeneous countries. India, which is, in my mind, is a miracle, right? It's a country that has 1,600 languages, has many, many religions, and it sort of holds together. Some people think that maybe it's because there are so many that it's easier than if there were two, that there's less polarization. So when there are two or close to two, it becomes maybe harder than when there's that many. But Pakistan and Indonesia are countries that say, Pakistan has a bunch of languages, but in the definition of Pakistan is that it's a Muslim country. In the definition of Indonesia is that it is a Muslim country. And religion is a very important glue to keep all this heterogeneity together. So I'm going to propose a couple of hypotheses. The first one is that a sense of us to be successful, to survive politically and so on, needs to emphasize the areas or the dimensions where there's least heterogeneity between us and greater heterogeneity vis-a-vis them. So for example, in the case of Albania, Albania is a country that's a little bit over 50% Muslim, 30% Catholic, 20% Greek Orthodox. Or the numbers are not quite, but more or less. But they speak Albanian. And the Serbs and the Greeks don't. So religion has to sort of like go out of the window, because if you have external enemies and you have internal religious divisions, forget religion. Religion kind of disappears in the sense of us. The religion, us is not based on religion. In Pakistan, they have all these different languages. And if they are going to keep the stuff together, religion is going to be the anchor. So different countries end up using different dimensions of language, religion, race, or whatever to create a sense of us. A deeper shared sense of us implies an easier time at agreeing on public goods. It's easier to run a government where there's a broad, deep sense of us, because the government is supposed to act on behalf of us, and if you have a fairly homogeneous us, it makes life easier. The Scandinavians are very generous in redistributing, but one of the reasons why they're so generous in redistributing is because the poor in Scandinavia are blonde with blue eyes. But if the poor in Scandinavia were a slightly different race, maybe the willingness to collaborate would collapse. So there are gains from broadening the sense of us, because the greater the heterogeneity you have in your country, maybe the more technologies that you can have available. And we've done a lot of work on the importance of immigration to diversification, technology absorption, and so on, because it's much easier to move people than it is to move know-how into people. It's much easier to move brains than to move know-how into brains. And many countries in the developing world, because they have a very restrictive sense of us, are very close to international migration, and as a consequence, they don't get the benefit of having a broader, more encompassing sense of us. So, the sense of us is based on some kind of an imagined community, and we better understand this imagined community, because if we don't, others will understand it before us, and they will manipulate us, right? So that's what Cambridge Analytica is supposed to do. They are supposed to understand what makes us tick, what gives us a fear of them, what makes us vote in a certain way. And so the question is, can the sense of us be shaped by the better angels of our nature, and not just by the fear of the other? Thank you very much. Arturo? One second.
Fantastic speech. I would really love to have a copy of that, because I think it's something that really is very meaningful to all of us. But what I wanted to ask was the interaction then between technology and morality. That is, do we adopt the morality that's useful for our level of technology? That's one of the hypotheses out there.
Okay. Let me take a few so that I get to get, and that way we minimize on time. Any other questions? Hilda.
It's the class of actors in a particular demographic pyramid. The clashes between the yuppies and the millennials, particularly that will increase as the yuppies move into the poorer class, have to rely on the millennials working for them. How do you, within a society that is tied together by family ties, you hope, begin classifying the various demographic stages of aging? The retired versus the working force.
Good. Yes.
I was very interested what you said about the European Union. And in fact, if you take one phenomenon, you probably find a good confirmation. We have been broadening, we have been enlarging, as we say, for the last 30 years. We have not actually been deepening for a long time. Now we are no longer in the process of enlarging, now we're in the process of deepening, and we come to the limits. I would be very interested to hear what you think about that, whether you have thought about it, because the real conflicts which are going on now and the real problems are with the deepening.
Yeah.
Ricardo, thanks so much for this. You said that the Industrial Revolution needed public goods, new public goods. It seems to me the Industrial Revolution would be mainly indifferent between whether the goods were public or private, maybe even has a preference for private. And it seems to me a different framing might be that the Industrial Revolution gave an opening for states to increase their power by providing more in the way of public goods.
Okay.
What are your thoughts?
Good. Okay, so let me, before I forget about the different comments, so I'll start in reverse order. You know, cars needed roads. Rail cars needed railways, needed the ability to expropriate the eminent domain, et cetera, in order to build the complements of private goods. You needed to have electricity lines crossing other people's property and so on. You needed to have property rights on the spectrum to have cell phones or radio or television and so on. So that's why you generated all of these norms and standards and infrastructure and so on that allowed for many of these goods to be produced that rely on these inputs. And that's why all these industries are constantly lobbying for aspects of legislation or aspects of government services that are important for their operation. With respect to the feelings, deeper feelings of European, how do you get a deeper Europe? I think, no, you should have, there has to be passion behind the European project. It cannot be that I should vote for Remain in Britain because GDP will be higher, right? If you cannot, if that's, you know, or if I leave, it's going to be a disaster. If there is no passion behind the European project, you're dead. So the European project needs a sense of us to accompany it, needs a sense of this purpose. And I think that, you know, there are some things that Europe does that underpins that sense. For example, the Erasmus program. The Erasmus program gives every European kid the possibility to study in a different place and learn about it. So thank God I'm European. I have all of Europe for me to study and so on. I particularly like Eurovision, because in Eurovision, sort of like you're enjoying everybody's art, but you cannot vote for your own. You have to vote and find value in other people's art. I find that also as a very important example of how you build up a sense of belonging to a broader community and a sense of pride. I work a lot on Albania. The Albanian dream is to be European. And I can understand, so you better connect with why is Europe such an emotional project for Albanians? That is what sort of like Europeans have to build upon. So I would. Come over and explain this to people. Well, but in part because, as Jascha Munk is going to say tomorrow, we have used technocratic Europe as a way of getting many political decisions outside of local politics. And that's generating what he might call a democratic deficit. But I think that Europe has to be underpinned by an aspiration of an imagined community where we all belong here. Arturo asked the question of technology and ethics. I think that, psychologists believe that all of these moral sentiments evolve to regulate behavior. And so if the technology is to drive, say, cars, the question is honking an insult, or is it a polite way of saying, I'm here, don't cross over, right? Should we drive on the right or on the left? What constitutes aggressive driving and so on? So every technology, for example, it apparently is, I don't know if you've noticed, it apparently is very impolite to send messages in capital letters. So when you put capital, fake news, right? It means like you're yelling. So every technology needs a set of moral codes that go with it to say, what's decent, what's appropriate, what's expected, what's unacceptable. And your question on demographics, I'm going to have to give up because I haven't thought about it, about the yuppies. And I think that the fundamental split in the country at the present time is between a broader sense of us that includes all the minorities, the Latinos, the African Americans, LGBTQ community, and so on, and sort of like the more us, meaning us, white America, and so on. And that in some sense, that is the dominant tension on the fight over the sense of us in the US.